Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Cybersecurity Zero Trust, Why Visibility is the Key. On behalf of Beckers, I'm Erica Carbajal, and thanks so much for joining us again. Before we start off, I have a few just background housekeeping notes to go through. So we're going to begin the webinar with a presentation, and there's going to be time at the end of the hour for question and answer sessions. So you can submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A box that you should see on the right side of your screen. The session is also being recorded, so it's going to be accessible after the event as well, using the same information you used to log into today's webinar. And if at any time you're having any tech audio issues or not seeing the slides move, you can try refreshing your browser or using that same Q&A box for any technical questions. We have people on the back end to help out with those. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome today's presenters. First, we have Dr. Tom Mustak, Senior Director of Cybersecurity at Mount Sinai Health System. We also have Dan DeSantis, Director of CISO Advisors at Cisco, and Steve Baum, Global Head of Manufacturer Alliances at Mitigate. So Tom, Dan, and Steve, thanks again for being here today. And Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Oh, well, hey, it's great to be here. I'm Dan DeSantis. I'm the director of a team here called CISO Advisors at Cisco. As the name implies, my team is comprised of former chief information security officers. And we get to hang out with some really cool folks like Tom here on the call. So we're all about just making sure that Cisco is elevating its relevance with senior security executives like Tom. So glad to be here. Steve?
Thank you, Dan. Steve Baum. I'm joining here from Mitigate. I work in the Technical Alliances team and head up the business development activities with medical device manufacturers. I have a background in IV infusion and medication management, working at large med tech companies and integrating solutions with EMR and alerting systems. Really excited to be speaking with the team today and discussing some of the challenges that health systems face in managing network medical devices and exploring opportunities and approaches to reducing cybersecurity risks. So thank you. Tom?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Steve. I'm Tom Mustak, the Senior Director for Cybersecurity at Mount Sinai Health System in New York City. I'm responsible for securing our medical devices, IoT devices, building systems, and other connected systems throughout our organization. My background has taken me through the manufacturing vertical, the financial services vertical, and now healthcare. And pretty much I've followed wherever the fires have been. So healthcare seemed to need a lot of help a couple of years ago, and that's what brought me here.
Tom, it's, listen, context matters here. So you tell us a bit more about Mount Sinai. I mean, you're a pretty good sized organization doing a lot of good for patients out there. What's the story?
Sure. So Mount Sinai Health System is an integrated healthcare system in New York City. We're internationally acclaimed for our excellence in research, patient care, and education across a range of specialties. We have 8 campuses, pretty major campuses in the New York City area, over 400 regional ambulatory practices throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City, Westchester, and Long Island, 13 freestanding joint venture centers, over 7,200 physicians, and 45,000 employees, which when you calculate out how many devices we must have, is quite a few.
Yeah, for sure. And suffice to say, a fair bit of challenge with gaining visibility into that environment. Which, Tom, that's our first question here for you. And so if you roll back the clock a few years, what are some of the challenges that you were dealing with in terms of having visibility into your medical device inventory and identifying those assets? By the way, mitigating some of the threats, because we know there's some challenges around. Even if you can identify them, you might not be able to do much with them. So would you give us some perspective on that?
Correct. So if you were to roll back the clock a few years when the industry first started taking notice of the cybersecurity challenge of medical devices, most organizations were pretty much working with 2 different teams, right? You had a biomed team that was responsible for keeping your devices running, and you had a IT team which kept your your networks and the rest of your operations running. So for the IT team, it was all about bits and bytes and keeping machines running. On the biomed side, it was all about patient safety and keeping those devices safe for clinical use. The two would only meet where you needed to exchange information about how to get something on the network. And back then, when IT folks would look at their network tools, they would see a Windows device, right? Which in fact may have been a CT, or it may have been an MRI, or an ultrasound, or what have you. So as things evolved, people realized that if you couldn't tell what the device was, you were very limited on what you could do with it, because you didn't know what was happening at the other end. Was it attached to a patient? Was it delivering critical care? If I go and scan it, is it going to knock it off the network and I don't know what it is or where it is? So visibility, gaining awareness of what you have, and visibility were the first challenges. And it's critical that you know what these things are and what they're doing, whether they're in use. And I like to say to people all the time that without that visibility, it's pretty much the equivalent of running in a dark room full of sharp objects. And you're not going to come out the other end in very good shape.
Interesting.
That's a good one. Yeah. Steve, I just have a question, because it's not just medical devices, right? I mean, rumor has it you had some automobiles showing up on your network, right?
So when you look at your entire network, right, you have very different segments of your network. You have guest networks, you have patient networks, you have clinical networks, and different areas of the organization are exposed to those different areas of the network. In a medical environment such as ours, where we're very diverse, all populations, you're going to find every single connected device you could possibly find. So that's going to include automobiles. It's going to include connected exercise equipment like Pelotons, gaming systems if you have a children's hospital. And without the visibility and the context, as you mentioned earlier about the importance of context, the first reaction to seeing a gaming system in a hospital is like, well, I got to find whose desk this is on and I got to unplug it, right? But you have a children's hospital and it's helping kids get through a very tough time in their lives.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry, Steve, I didn't mean to step on you there. I just think that's another interesting dimension to the conversation, right? But go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I wanted to add, just kind of build on that. And Tom, maybe you can share a little bit more about how you would go about managing those devices. I mean, visibility being the first building block to understanding what you have, but I can imagine patching being a real challenge. That you've got so many devices, you got new devices coming on the network. Can you unpack that a little bit for us, and also kind of dovetail into why you moved more towards a segmentation and network security as a strategy?
So with segmentation, I mean, we had to go down a path of what can we control, what can't we control. As you mentioned, patching is very difficult. Even though these devices may be running on a Windows 10 operating system, which unfortunately is not as common as we would like it to be. It's more like Windows 7, Windows 95 in some cases. The patches aren't available quick enough, because even though the operating system manufacturer, Microsoft, may put the patch out there, we can't go out there and just download it off the web, search for the build you have, find it, download it, and put it on, because it may alter the operation of the device, and no one wants to take that kind of a risk with patient safety. So we have to wait for the patch to be released by the manufacturer. There's also complexity in then scheduling it, right? Who's going to put the patch on? You need to have multiple teams available. Your IT people, the device vendor may need to be involved. You may need to shut down a unit to go and put these patches on, which puts an interruption in the patient care continuum. So patching is extremely difficult to do when it's available even. It's extremely slow because of all the complexity in it. And then we go down the path of segmentation, where we're able to see what we have on our networks. We're able to observe these devices over a period of time to see how they operate based on what they are. Who do they need to talk to, right? Do they need to go outside the organization? Do they need to go to certain areas of the organization? What ports, protocols, and IPs are used? And we create a model policy around that. So that's monitored for a period of time, depending on the severity or the complexity of the device. We may go up to 3-4 months monitoring it, look for violations if there are some. that might be valid because you might be doing some research or external connectivity to a third party where you're sharing medical data, so it might be valid traffic. We'll adjust our policies, continue to monitor. Once we feel we have it locked down tightly, then you target 1 or 2 devices that you could apply that policy to using network segmentation. Continue to monitor them, see to be confirmed for 10,000% that nothing goes wrong and nothing unanticipated happens. And then you can push that policy out to the bigger population of devices in your environment.
Tom, thanks for that. Clearly part of the mitigation strategy here is building that device inventory, segmentation, building and applying the policy, and of course having that general overall awareness. Would you mind taking us a little deeper though on this conversation and tell us a bit about some of the solutions that you've pursued to help with these goals around enhanced visibility, policy application, segmentation? I think the audience would benefit to hear about that.
So, as I mentioned, we've gone ahead and figured out what we have in our environment, created segments of devices grouped around the functionality they provide, the modality that they are, and then created those policies to support that. So in effect, what you end up doing is shutting out all the unanticipated traffic that you don't expect to happen, that shouldn't happen, right? Devices typically will communicate within your environment to other related systems and to the manufacturer for updates and remote support. And that's about it. You shouldn't be able to get onto a browser on an ultrasound and start going out to surf your stock quotes, right? That's something that you really want to lock down as much as you can.
And one thing, Tom, as we look at creating these policies for the devices, it's still important for these devices to speak with other clinical systems to deliver care and the efficiencies and safety. Is there an approach you took at looking at how you can move towards like a zero trust philosophy, but without restricting that clinical communication that's needed between these systems?
So, I mean, again, it's really understanding what those devices are doing in your environment, using the monitoring visibility tools that you have to understand what the device is doing, who it's communicating to, how it's communicating, and then you draw those policies in as tight as you can. So, for example, if you had a GE CT and it had remote capability to GE, there's a group of IP addresses you'll be connecting to. So you restrict connectivity to them on the ports and protocols that you agree to with the manufacturer. You'll know internally in your PAC system where you're sending images to. You'll open that up. If you're feeding things into your EMR system, you'll leave that open. But that's about it. You don't want anyone that can plug into your network to be able to get to that device. And I know that there is some apprehension early on when you're doing these things. Some people will come around and say, well, why do I want to put these policies in? If something new is coming in, it might inhibit operations. Well, that device doesn't really become critical to operations until it's installed, right? And during that install period, that's where you're going to learn these things anyway. If something new pops up, that's when you'll learn about it, and you'll go in and you'll build on your policies to allow that additional traffic if it's warranted.
Are you able to really look at that traffic and monitor that traffic to make sure that there's no, ports that are turned off or protocols that should have been enabled, so you can monitor after it's been deployed, or things may change over time? Can you share a little bit more about how you would go about monitoring that?
So in the visibility tool that we're using, which happens to be Mitigate, we're able to see violations to policy. So that's continuously monitored. We're looking for any kind of violations, and we'll chase them down and say, was this legitimate? Is this something we need to change? Or is it something that we're okay and it should be restricted? And if it's something that should be restricted, it gives you that opportunity to take that extra deeper look to look for the source of that traffic. Is it legitimate? Should it have been blocked somewhere else? And it gives you that forward-looking, proactive approach to be able to eliminate noise on your network before it becomes an issue.
There's a couple of good questions coming in, Steve here and Tom, that I think are germane to the conversation. So Russ Ward, we appreciate your chiming in, and Eric, we'll come back to you in a second. Russ, you're absolutely patching a big issue. This is something that transcends, quite frankly, medical devices. This goes back to the whole Log4j conversation, which is around building that catalog and dependency mapping and relationship mapping. Tom, would you mind sharing? I think this might help address Russ's question around how we look at, or his comment rather, on how we look at moving beyond just the patch aspect of this and looking at application dependencies and ownership. What's that look like for you?
Well, we're able to also look at what applications are installed on the endpoints. So you can do some research on what applications are there. If there's an executable out there, you can search and find them. As we've been talking a lot about SBOM recently, right, with our various groups, and as a healthcare organization, the SBOM does not give you a lot of direct things that you can go in and fix. Like if I find out that a Log4j executable is on a medical device, I can't fix it or block it without the manufacturer's support. But what it does do is it tells me where it is and identifies the risk. So then there are proactive things that we can do to try to contain the potential damage that could happen if that was to be exposed.
Makes sense. You can tell a little bit about this, addresses Eric's question, specifically about some of the, obviously you're doing a fair bit of work with Mitigate. I know you're doing some work with Cisco. You drill a bit more into some of the tools that you're using for policy creation and enforcement?
So most of our policy creation is done through identification of the needs and what's happening using the Mitigate tool set. And then we will create our ACLs and policies and move them manually into Cisco ICE. So the reason that we keep them separately, I believe the Mitigate does have the capability of pushing policies directly to Cisco ICE. We chose to keep that separate so that you have that isolation to ensure that you manually went through, verified everything before you move it.
Right, that was one of the best practices that we had have come to our customer base with, is you can monitor that communication with almost like a digital twin of the policy behind the scenes, and will flag if there's a violation of that policy, or maybe it's a communication that was intended that should have been added to the rule. So you can safely monitor what that policy would behave like on your network without having to actually physically move that policy. And once you've monitored that for a week or two, and you feel comfortable to move it, it gives you that opportunity to do that test, kind of as almost a test server to production server type approach.
Yeah, and when your monitoring is happening on a mirror of your traffic, there is no performance impact of doing the scanning and monitoring of your networks. It's not like you're in line between a device that's providing critical patient care, and it raises doubt with people about what the impact of performance is. That doubt isn't there because you are separate and isolated.
So even if you went back to a patching approach, you mentioned before this kind of multidisciplinary challenges. You've got the clinical engineering team, you've got your network team, you've got info security. Could you practically manage these patches well across these groups, even from an ownership standpoint? Is that itself a challenge that you were facing?
Well, it's a challenge because, if you take, for example, a Microsoft patch, it affects multiple manufacturers in your environment. You have to work with each one to track that patch through to availability and then coordinate the update of that patch, the installation. So it can be quite disruptive, and it can be a very long initiative, which, if you come from a different vertical like manufacturing or finance or any other vertical, you don't have to deal with the patient safety aspects or the complexity of delivering critical care. you can much easier schedule downtime. Even in finance, you don't want a lot of downtime, but there's that window between maybe 3 and 5 a.m. where you could take systems down real quick, patch them, or rotate things in and out of production until you get them done. We don't have those same luxuries in the healthcare space.
So we read a lot about how the industry is facing a shortage of talent, right? Particularly as these devices are more and more networked. You've got a visibility now into all these risks. The multidisciplinary teams that might be managing it, some may be managed from a patching perspective by the manufacturer. Some are going to be clinical engineering applied. You've got the network team that may be involved in your segmentation. When you looked at kind of the cultural and resource aspect of operating the solution, were there any trade-offs that you were looking at relative to an investment in kind of a more of a traditional patch approach versus more the segmentation and network policy approach? Any lessons learned as you went through this and trade-offs that were notable?
Well, one of the opportunities that the Mitigate solution brought to life is that we were able to create views into the asset inventory for asset owners. So we were able to leverage the teams that support these systems day to day, keeping them operational in the clinical space in that conversation. And it also helps to breed that security culture where people can see what IT is talking about, what the security guy that keeps calling me is talking about. There's these 10 systems and they need this patch to be applied, and it's been sitting out there for 6 months, a year, whatever the time frame is. You engage them in that conversation and they help you push things with the manufacturers. They help you come up with solutions because they're involved in that discussion. So they can help you gain that visibility into the operational effects that you would never get from an IT-only approach where you're just sitting behind the glass panel saying, hey, I need to patch this thing and here's the deadline. It's very different when you pull people into that conversation and there's a back and forth. You come up with much better and more creative solutions and more effective ultimately.
But it's not to say that you're not patching, obviously. I'm sure it's that you patch when available. But did you see any maybe returns from a resource perspective if you had really gone like we're gonna manage this every patch that comes out, we're gonna find every device, get it on there as quick as possible? Was there any resource or investment type benefit that you received as going with the segment and policy first that might have bought you some return on investment?
Well, one big opportunity is that by limiting access, you also limit the exploitability of a lot of different vulnerabilities. So by only doing your segmentation, you might eliminate the majority of your open vulnerabilities. So to your earlier point, you still want to patch when that patch becomes available because it gives you that extra assurance and you know that things are up to date and there are typically other efficiencies that get rolled into patches. So you definitely want to keep your patches up to date. But by eliminating the exposure of the device, you also eliminate the probability for exploitation, for vulnerabilities that even haven't been found yet.
Right.
Makes sense. We got a bunch of questions here, Steve. So, by the way, Eric out there, Eric Sanchez, thank you for the comment. Number one vertical outside of Mitigate having a significant amount of traction in healthcare, identity services engine here at Cisco. Healthcare is certainly one of our more prominent verticals where there's strong interactions or strong integrations rather with our friends like Mitigate. So absolutely, you've got a lot of company in that area. Steve, one of the questions, and Tom, one of the questions that came up from Randy is, did the Mitigate tools provide visibility to just biomed, or were there other aspects or other devices in the environment that the Mitigate technology helped with?
It actually provided a lot more visibility than I believe was expected by anyone. The initial ask was that we wanted to identify where all our medical devices were, But as I mentioned earlier, you start finding everything from gaming systems to elevator controllers, Echo devices. I don't want to say the first name because mine will answer me in the background. Gaming systems, you name it. If it can be connected into an Ethernet jack, you begin seeing all these devices and seeing the vulnerabilities that are behind them as well.
I think it's one of the benefits of the approach that we've taken with respect to network discovery, device discovery, that once these devices are chatting on the network, we're able to see that traffic. And again, it's mirrored, so it's safe for analysis. We see that traffic, we're able to profile it. So as a new device comes on the network, we actually highlight that on the dashboard. And maybe that's a good question to volley back to you, Tom. So when a new device pops on, you talked about Xboxes, Teslas. How do you triage that when you see a new device come on?
So the first thing we do is go in and identify what it is, where it is, and should it be there? What controls do we want around it? Since we're seeing across our VLAN segments and across our network, if it comes up in our guest network, you may not be concerned with it. One area I do monitor guest networks for anyway is, do we have devices that should be protected that are ending up there because you have someone taking a quick shortcut to get something online? So that is something that I'll continuously monitor to say, is our network, our guest network, truly our guest equipment, or did somebody pop something on there because they were quickly getting something up and running? So that might be an acceptable solution for an hour or to prove something out. I wouldn't want a medical device sitting on a guest network for any extended period of time.
Sure. Yeah, I know with all the iPhones that everyone's carrying around today, you probably see a lot of those devices pop up. But it's always interesting to hear a Tesla that's pulled up near the network is now online. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, for sure. Lydell has the. Go ahead, Steve.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say maybe we should look at a couple of questions here as well.
Yeah, I mean, Lydell, I think, has a couple of related questions in the audience, regarding integration. So it's sort of a two-pronged question here, Tom. Where is the enforcement going on? And then with what is the integration happening with Mitigate and Identity Services Engine in the areas of firewall, wireless LAN, et cetera? So can you talk a bit more about that enforcement integration aspect of solution?
So the enforcement happens on the Cisco ISE side. That's where the policies are implemented and enforced. The research happens on the Mitigate side to confirm that we're building the policies that we need. And once we have that model and we prove that we're happy with the experience we're seeing as far as policy violations, then it gets moved over to Cisco ISE, and that's where it's implemented and enforced.
Makes sense. We're going to get back to some of these questions. Steve, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add into that, but I know we've got some more questions in the audience. And Tom, we got to get to, where are we going? What's next for us here? And maybe some of this ties into some of the questions that I'm seeing in the crowd, which include things on, I think really working with the manufacturers, getting them to own device security. But to the extent that you can talk about the future here, especially as it relates to your organization, what's next?
Well, the conversations that we're able to have with the manufacturers now and the service providers are much more informed and much more intelligent. We're able to come to the table with true data showing them what their devices are doing, what our concerns are, and what we're trying to accomplish. So it's a lot more engaging than calling them up and saying like, hey, I want you to secure them. And I'll say, yeah, there's a firewall, it's secure. Well, now I can tell you, well, here's what your device is doing. Here's how many I have. Here's when they communicate. And how they're communicating, and we can work through those discussions in a much more productive manner than ever before. We're going to continue to see an evolution towards zero trust. We're going to see more proactive scanning of devices before they come into the environment, where we can set up test labs now and monitor and scan things before we ever put them online. as opposed to dealing with an environment that's already built. I mean, that's what the world inherited, the medical world at least, a couple of years ago when we started getting this visibility. It was all there, and we plugged in these systems to start scanning and identifying stuff, and then, well, I didn't know I had those. What are they doing here? Who owns them? Those discussions are gone. Now it's more proactive, saying, okay, these are coming in. I want a test device before day one, and I'll put it on my network in a closed VLAN, and I can start scanning it and monitoring it. Is it doing what you told me it's doing? So it's much more informed conversations. I think it's becoming a lot tougher for the medical manufacturers also, because now the emperor has no clothes and knows it, right? So they have to work with it. And in fairness to the manufacturers, I mean, a lot of these devices were not built or designed in a time where these threats were in the world. So we do need to work with each other collaboratively to come up with solutions and work toward that end goal, and not pull away a little bit from the discussions of liability always, right? It's all about a collective concern for patient safety. That's why we all get up in the morning. That's why we do what we do.
That's a good observation. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, there was a question from Dan Landsberg that I thought might be really helpful for the group here. It's around the time requirement to set this up, and I think a little bit even more specifically around inventorying everything. Maybe you could walk us through a little bit of your experience from the implementation, how the devices became online and discovered, what resources it took for that to happen, and then really moving into the policy management piece to just provide a little bit of color on the implementation cycles there.
So for getting the discovery systems up and running like Mitigate, the majority of them out there are working off of network taps. So the big lift is getting that open network tap in your data center, getting the power lined up so that these devices can be racked and plugged in. Once they're up and running, you start seeing data within hours. Within hours, you'll start seeing a lot of your population come in. Within, I'd say, about a week or so, things start slowing down, and the majority of your population has already been identified and inventoried. So the lift is not as big as it sounds. It's a lot scarier than it sounds, and the beauty of it is, like I said before, you don't have a negative impact on the performance of your network or any of your devices because you're looking at passive traffic.
I think there was another question from Melissa Paper that came in around assessing device risk. So we've got all these network devices. I briefly touched on SBOM, but the correlation of that particular device to maybe some known vulnerabilities. How do you assess the risk, and what tools might be helping you with looking at that from a risk perspective?
Not sure I understand what the question is there.
So from prioritizing, if you're looking at prioritizing a patch, for example, are you able to look at the risk of a particular device and assess a device that might be higher priority risk than another?
So you're able to see, one of the things that I do really like about the way devices are identified is there's a field called consequence of failure. And that's broken down into the ability of causing patient death, patient injury, delayed care or misdiagnosis. So you're able to fit that in along the priorities of the risks that are out there. How exploitable is the vulnerability? Does the device have public internet access? How many users there are, where it is physically in your hospital, which ward it's on, and what level of patient care is being delivered with the device. And then you tie in that consequence of failure. It gives you a good picture of the importance of addressing things and in what priority.
Yeah, and that active exploitability field is pretty nice that way too, to give you a sense of which one of these vulnerabilities are known to be exploited in the wild.
And Steve and Tom, I'll tell you that this is an area where not only through some of our partnerships like with Mitigate, but through some of the acquisitions Cisco's made, we've been exploring the notion of likelihood of exploits. There's something called the EPSS, which is an exploit prediction scoring system that was developed by First.org. If you're not familiar with First.org, this is a way of saying, hey, listen, this exploit has a higher likelihood of being exploited, and here's the potential impact. And part of that obviously gets back to some of what Tom's talking about. This is a system that, if it's exploited, could have a life or death consequence, right? So that's part of that business risk conversation. Steve, I know we got a bunch of other questions here. Do we want to address some of these as well?
Yeah, I know there's one about the Cisco deployment and network switches. I don't know if you want to take that one, Dan, or I can jump in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so again, Lydell, I know you are sort of very curious about timeline for deployment, and I know for folks like Tom, time to value of any investment, whether it's with Mitigate or Cisco Identity Services Engine, which is our ICE solution, is top of mind. I will say that from my perspective, having in my past life supported a lot of customers that have deployed ICE, the answer is it depends. Right, and some of this is associated with the amount of tech debt you have in the environment. So, Identity Services Engine does require that you run certain OS levels in your environment, and I won't get into the weeds here too much, but sort of the state of your current environment might dictate your ability to do comprehensive deployment for ICE. So that's why it's always important to sort of scope that and decide, okay, where do I start, turning this capability up? It can't be a boil the ocean approach necessarily. You start looking for, where am I going to get the most bang for the buck, and look at it programmatically. But no, I don't know, Tom, if that dovetails with your experience. I mean, I know that there are some dependencies for, deploying a solution like 802.1x Identity Services Engine, and I'm sure Mitigate as well.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces in every hospital environment. The bigger the organization is, the more of these initiatives you'll have on simultaneously. So communications between the teams and proper project planning is always going to be key. So you definitely need to ensure that all of your stakeholders are engaged. Everybody clearly understands what the objectives are, what we're doing, the order that we're doing things, and so on. So, yeah, every one of these is going to come with its own challenges.
It might be good to compare and contrast to, not doing this, right? If you go back to a patch-only strategy, which is important, patch when the patch is available, this is an ongoing effort. There's new CVEs coming out every week, every new software version that's released. So maybe you can talk a little bit just about the liability of a patch-only strategy, and the benefit that you saw with augmenting this policy strategy. What the decision point and outcome difference that you see with these two approaches.
Well, I mean, with the patch-only strategy, you could take that approach and say, well, the medical device manufacturer is responsible for the device, for how it operates, for adhering to the design requirements that were approved by the FDA. That's all true. But when something goes wrong, it's your reputation, it's your organization, it's your patients, it's your staff that's on the hook, because we're aware of these things, and once we're aware of them, we do need to start addressing them, right, to the best of our ability. And to my earlier point, if you start to isolate things, if you have a sharp object, I like simple analogies. You have a sharp object, a kitchen knife. It can hurt you, or it can prepare your dinner, right? And give it to a scalpel, to a surgeon, and he can do miraculous surgeries with it. But if you limit it to put it into a locked container that's only accessible to the people that need to use it, then you can ensure that it's only used most likely for the outcomes that you want, right? So the analogy to patching there is, when you isolate that device and it's only available to the proper staff in your organization, it can only communicate to the locations where it should be communicating, the chances of someone coming along and exploiting it are reduced tremendously. If you leave it wide open and just leave it sitting there on a table, well, anybody can come along and do what they want with it, good or bad.
Right. Thanks for sharing that. There was a question from Brian Boyd around bandwidth. Have you seen any impact from your perspective, Tom, on or concern from a bandwidth perspective?
No, because the way that it operates, if there is a challenge on bandwidth, the advantage will go to the production environment and to the devices. So we may lose data on the Mitigate side, and that'll be picked up later in later scans, but it will not impact the production environment and the availability of our devices.
Good one. Well, and a fair bit of ways back in some of the questions here, I know, Brian, you asked about, and there was another, I think, sort of associated question here around the team aspect of this, the operational aspect of this, and, how that's done inside your organization. Is there an outsourcing component of this? So, we touched on this a little bit with Steve's question about, the talent crisis out there, but can you help the audience here understand a bit about maybe some of the operational aspects of this in employing the team?
Well, for me, it worked very well that I was able to leverage the clinical areas and other IT support areas that are already existing and supporting different aspects of the devices to have input into the creation of policies and the outcomes and playbooks of how we deal with things. Whereas if we were working in a vacuum, we would have had to have a lot more centralized.
Uh-oh.
Looks like Tom might be frozen in time here. You there, Tom?
We'll get him. We'll get him back. A new Tesla came on a network. Well, so I know while we're trying to get Tom back here, and again, Lydell, I know a lot of your questions get into the minutia, both on the Mitigate side of the house as well as here at Cisco. We have architects, we have services organizations that are focused on, okay, what does that design flow look like? And the good news is there's a strong partnership here between organizations. Between Mitigate and between Cisco. So, existing integrations exist. And so, part of the network you have and the capabilities in your environment. I'm sure if you want to reach out as a follow-up to any of us after this, we can make sure you're in contact with the appropriate parties. Certainly your account teams from Mitigate and Cisco can help you with that.
Yeah, in the meantime, maybe I'll address one of the questions from Tommy, which is, what is the approach to replacing or isolating some of these higher risk devices? I think the first approach is discovery. You have to identify the device, but then profiling that device from a risk perspective, we're able to look at, as Tom pointed out, the clinical risk and severity of impact, and marry that against two other main vectors. One of them being network risk, which this discussion around segmentation and policy can help reduce that exposure, and then the risk of the vulnerabilities that may be present on that device. So not only do we look at the discovery of the device, but we profile that device and correlate its software bill of materials essentially against known published CVEs. And these vulnerabilities will have risk published from the numbering authority itself. But we can look at what patch has been applied to that device, how severe is that risk, the probability, and provide a sense of prioritization around that. And in some cases, devices that are end of life may need to move towards an upgrade, or you can look at segmenting the device and reducing the risk even in those cases. But we provide the tools for you to make better decisions around its risk profile, and then optionality for patching segmentation, applying policies, or looking at its natural end of life and moving to the next device. So I think all these things need to be weighed, and Mitigate helps provide that context for the consumer.
Steve, and I know we have Tom back, and Russ has asked a few times in a different way about sort of the survey and assessment aspect of this. Getting visibility into those environments. Okay, what's there? How do I survey those environments? How do I is there a way to profile those environments right out of the gate? So I know that there's certain areas here that Cisco plays in, but Steve, I'm sure you can help there. And Tom, maybe you can share some best practices around getting that initial inventory.
Okay. Yeah, it starts starts with a passive discovery, which is one of the benefits of the system, where we're looking at that network traffic. But one of the things that we do is we do what we call deep packet inspection, where we're looking at the actual device information that's being communicated to other systems, what that device is communicating with. To our point earlier, we don't want to cut off a PACS integration for an imaging system. So knowing what that device needs to communicate with is important, but we also fundamentally profile that device based off of that packet information. So this is really fundamental to how we go about doing discovery, and some of the magic and intellectual property that the company's developed is around profiling that device. And we get it down to, in most cases, down to model and serial number, and then software version that's applied on that device. Additional information would be like MAC address, IP address, and other systems that we integrated with. We're aggregating information from other active scanning systems, the network information that we work with Cisco with as well. So it's really a culmination of a lot of details that comprise a device profile, but fundamentally it's coming from the manufacturer output from the device itself. So it's a highly trusted source of data that's driving the inventory build out.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Tom, one of the questions that was out there pertains to so this notion of convergence with health systems. And so Rob asked, how do you manage the service lines? And what's that? And I think part of the broader conversation there is, and I think in one of our prep calls, you told a story about sort of selling some of these capabilities in the organization and getting various other stakeholders on board. But can you comment a bit on how you manage the service lines?
Well, one of the neat features that we had was we're able to see how devices are being used. In some cases, we can get user IDs to see who's using them. So it helps you identify where they are based on switch location, physical location from your RTLS system, some of the user activity, the time of day that it's being used. For some of the imaging devices, it'll tell you the type of scans that are happening, whether it's a neck scan, back scan, what have you. So it helps you to provide them with more insight about their devices, which really engages audiences because they're seeing things that they don't normally see about their devices. And in addition to the vulnerabilities, where they sit, what are the things they can communicate with, and it just pushes that communication to the next level that people are getting engaged, they're getting interested. It helps drive a tighter security culture, and it helps us to relate to each other and work more toward these solutions.
Yeah, sure. Makes sense.
Interesting aside to that on the location is the access point maps to the physical location maps is something that we do as well. So we can import that and allow that overlay. So one of the big challenges has always been, where's my IV pump, right? So being able to say, this is the last time it's connected with this AP. And with these, 802.11a, voice over Wi-Fi type honeycomb networks, the resolution just off of the access points are pretty good. It's much better than it used to be with like the old BNG networks, right? So, in some cases upstairs, downstairs, but you're typically within 15 or 20 feet of where that device has been discovered. So that's a big help. And then we overlay that with, the the service line information that kind of comes with that. So you basically get a physical location map, service line type information, and then multiply that across the health system and the facilities that we can manage in one dashboard.
Yeah, and just to click into that, there's a physical floor map that will be displayed for you on the screen, showing you the room number or the location that you can go and find the device at, which is really pretty neat. It's kind of like a Google Maps for your devices.
Right, exactly.
Hey, Steve, another question. I know we're getting close to needing to wrap here. And by the way, if we don't get to all of your questions, we'll make sure we get written responses out. So appreciate all the questions that have come in, and we're going to apologize in advance if we don't hit them all. Brian asked about reverse engineering of threats, and there's a lot of interpretations to that. I'm not sure, Steve, you can comment how Mitigate approaches that. It sounds a little bit like sandboxing to me, or detonation of threats, and sort of finding out what they do. Maybe the broader conversation there, Tom, for you would be is how are you ingesting this data, putting this into your SOC operation? Are you building any run books around, threat vector and vulnerability for medical devices? So maybe, Steve, we can start with you first, and then Tom, maybe you can pick up on that.
I'll just start with the same discovery theme. So as we're looking at network traffic and these devices, we can look for anomalous behavior, right? And as we see things that look odd, like why is this device speaking to somebody in Russia, or why is Russia trying to come in on? So we basically monitor for a number of different behaviors from a device. We understand normal device behavior and things that don't look normal, default passwords that might be used, clear text information that's not good. So there's really a long list, and we could probably have our own discussion just around threat intelligence. But we do provide monitoring and alerting and building out certain rules that can feed into your SIM and SOC workflows for monitoring and responding to these potential threats. Tom,
Makes sense.
Hand it off to you to see if there's anything you want to kind of add to that perspective.
So there's also a number of integrations with your EDR tools and your managed device platform tools, so that as devices and behaviors are identified, this can feed back into your Splunk and your SOC and your CrowdStrike or whatever other tools you have out there, so that your SOC can take action on them. And you do have to develop strong workbooks on how you engage, right? Because you can't treat a medical device the way you would a desktop. You can't run out and say, I believe it's compromised, you need to log off right now, I need this machine. It might be sitting in an operating theater, it might be sitting in an emergency room, and it's attached to a patient. It needs to continue doing what it's doing, keeping that patient safe and getting better. That you can't just go in and treat it like a rogue device that you would in a normal IT environment and just pull it offline. So you do have to have very tight workbooks that integrate your clinical staff, your support staffs that are on the floors, as well as your IT and security teams to have a concerted effort to react as quickly as possible.
Thanks, guys, for that. It's obviously a broad domain, and I think, Steve, you bring up a good point. Is that is this device talking to this device or talking outside the network? Is this expected behavior? Right? So that behavioral aspect of the device. And Tom, it sounds like you've done a lot of integration work and tying this into the run books, but ingesting indicators of compromise, understanding the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the folks that are potentially trying to compromise the environment, and correlating that with high impact vulnerabilities. This all needs to be tied into your InfoSec or your SOC playbook. Listen, I think Steve, I don't know, or Tom, if you guys had any parting comments, but I think we're getting close on time. I know Erica's going to take us home, but any parting words for the audience?
Well, maybe just a question to Tom, just what he sees on the horizon and problems that he feels the industry should be striving to tackle that companies like Cisco and Mitigate can help with and so forth. Any guidance or vision you want to impart on us, Tom?
I would say one thing we have to continue doing collectively is harnessing the data that we have. There's a lot of data being collected, and focusing on getting smarter and faster at what we do. What can we do to develop run books to isolate devices quickly in a safe manner? What can we do to contain them on our networks if we feel that something's not right, and get to a point where we can do things more remotely, right? If you need to get physical feet on the ground from where things are being monitored to where they're being operated, that can take minutes or hours, right? Most places are probably in hours right now, most organizations. We want to get that down to as small a window as we can to continue making the environment safer and safer with each effort.
Great, thank you for that, Tom. No last comments from me other than a big thank you for your participation in this as well, Tom, and sharing your experience with the products, and thank you for sharing that with the audience.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, that's all the time.
Erica. Oh. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. You can make it. Did you have another comment to add?
No, I was just echoing Steve and Tom there. Thanks. And, partnerships like this are what make life easier for all you folks, all you practitioners out there. So go ahead, Erica.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Mustek, Dan, and Steve, for leading this great discussion on medical device cybersecurity. And thanks so much as well to Mitigate and Cisco for sponsoring the webinar. Please check out the resource section on the webinar console to learn more about the content and fill out the post-webinar survey. And as the speakers mentioned, they will be able to follow up with any questions that we didn't get time to today. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.